Merry Christmas, everybody. We're into December. We're getting there, huh? So I got some requests to do the metaphysics of the Christmas story. So that's what I'm going to do this morning. And as I was doing it, I was thinking, this is really it's not very much in the heart, it's kind of all in the head. But as we know, the Bible is a metaphysical book. The people who taught in the Middle East back in the day of Jesus taught in riddles and in lessons that you had to go home and try to figure out. And that's how they wrote. And so the Bible, when we look at the Bible, it doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of us because we come from the Greek logic, and the Greek logic is logical. And there's nothing in the Middle East around the stories and the riddles that they told that appears to be logical, including the Christmas story. Because all of the stories in the Bible have to do with you and me. They were stories that told what that kind of teaching meant to us. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Christmas story today. And, you know, the Bible spanned 1,100 years. It was a history of 1,100 years of the evolution of the human being as experienced and as written down by the Hebrews. Now, a chronicle means something that's in order, but I have to tell you, the Bible is not in any order. There's stories all through the Bible that happened way before the ones that came after. And nobody knows why or how they put them together. But for today, we're going to call them a chronicle. We're going to talk about how to interpret metaphysically the Bible and what it means. To look at something metaphysically means to look beyond the literal meaning. There's a literal meaning that we try to figure out in the Bible and it doesn't make any sense. And then there's that metaphysical meaning that makes all the sense. So we're going to talk about that today. And I'm going to give you some examples so that it can make maybe a little more sense to you. So when you look at the biblical history of the Hebrews, what you are looking at is stories where every person's name, every mountain, every river, every town meant something. So they would put those stories together, not necessarily that they were like the town where it really happened, but it could be the town that meant something to the story. Does that make sense to you? So we're gonna do that this morning, and one of the examples, just to give you an example, is the town of Bethlehem. The town of Bethlehem literally meant bread of life. The town of Bethlehem, the Bethlehem means the bread of life. It means the house of sustenance. So in that story, remember as we go through the Christmas story, what the word Bethlehem meant. Because when you put all those words together, they come up with a story for you, with a meaning for you. So the word Bethlehem means house of sustenance. It means that, in the ancients, in the time of Jesus, that was their life. Bread was often all they had, bread and wine. And sometimes they had some grain. But so this town was like the bread of life for them, to go to this town. And then the other town in the story of the Christmas birth was Nazareth. Remember, some of the stories showed Nazareth. Well, the name Nazareth literally meant branch. And if you go through the Bible, you see that in the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers, they were all the people who were important were listed by who was their father. It was like this big census of these 2 chapters in the Bible. And so that meant the branch. The branch, your relatives are your branch. That's the branch you came from. And so literally the name of Nazareth meant branch. So every word in a story told the story. So when you got through hearing the story, you knew what it meant for you, and how important that it was. So it was important to them to connect this baby that was going to be born, this baby Jesus that was going to be born. It was important to connect him to King David. So he came from the branch of King David. So in the story, Nazareth plays a role in connecting Jesus to King David. That was the lineage. So whose Jesus' ancestors were very, very important to the Hebrews. So that's part of this story. In one of the Bible stories, Jesus is connected to Nazareth because it was important for them to know he was from the lineage of King David. The deeper meaning is revealed to awaken our spiritual understanding, which is our true divine nature. They felt like King David was divine. They felt like everybody that came after King David that was from his lineage was divine. And so some of the stories that were written about the birth of Jesus use these different names, these different towns, these different names of people to tell the story. There's only 2 books in the New Testament that actually tell you the story of the birth of Jesus. One is in Matthew and one is in Luke. And I don't know if any of you have ever read both of those. They're not the same. They don't tell the same story. One was written 70 years after the death of Jesus, and one was written 90 years after the death of Jesus. So if somebody tried to tell you what happened 90 years ago today, we might have more chronicles, more books, more stories, maybe an old newspaper clipping. They didn't have that then. All they had was word of mouth. They had stories that were passed on orally, but that had meaning for all of us. So all the stories and the myths and the names meant something to the information of the story. The writers talk about Herod, and Herod was the king that killed all the babies. When they found out that there was supposed to be a baby born, he didn't want this child to live because he was supposed to be the king of the Jews when he was born, so he killed all the babies. That's how they know how old Jesus was. They didn't know how old Jesus was, but they knew within about 3 years of Herod dying, and about 3 years before Herod dying, that was how old Jesus was, because he was killing all the babies, trying to kill the baby Jesus, trying to find him and kill him. So that's how they learned and how they wrote things down. And when you see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are merely names that a writer chose. It wasn't the disciple. It was the name that the writer chose because he hoped that he would then be able to be read. He would be famous enough to be read. So the stories were handed down over generations through oral teachings. And I don't know, have you all ever played telephone? Where you go around the room? When you get through, the story wasn't anything like the one you got whispered in your ear. That's kind of how this was after 90 years, after the story of Mary and Joseph and the baby. And one book tells that they went to Bethlehem, and another one tells that they went back home to Nazareth. They have totally different stories, but they both come out in the end to mean the same thing, which we will get to. One of the stories says that Mary and Joseph took the journey to pay the census, and that when they did that, she was almost ready to have this baby. But going to pay the census represented in the story, they were taking a process, a journey of transformation. Because think about Mary and Joseph's life. It was about to change drastically. He had, in those days, Joseph, the families were poor. So if they had too many girls, they would sell a girl to another person. But if the child was young, they would make a pact with the man that they sold their daughter to, that she would remain a virgin until she was of age. And so Joseph had made this pact with the parents of Mary that he would buy her, but she was very young. And he kept his word. So they got into a real sticky situation when suddenly she's going to have a baby, and he's kept his word, and now they're having to depend on this angel, this messenger from God called Gabriel. So just follow the story here a little bit and see how these things develop. And again, we're talking 90 years later. But part of this was because by the time that Jesus was chosen as the Christianity of the Greeks, 300 years had passed. 300 years of that story were being told. And remember, the Greeks, the Greek gods, all had the same story. They all had a hero that had a mother that was a virgin. They all died and they all came back to life. And so when they were telling the story of Jesus 300 years later to try to make Jesus the center of the Greek Christianity, they kind of threw in that Virgin Mary thing too. So, like I said, this feels a little dry, but we'll get to the truth of why I'm even taking you there this morning. But this is how they told the stories. They were metaphysical. They had every name had a purpose. Every story, the name of the story, told part of the story. So this place, this journey that symbolized the process of Mary and Joseph going to pay their census was part of the story about how their life was changing so drastically. They had a lot to deal with. They had a lot to be worried about. When the angel, the messenger from God named Gabriel, came to tell them that Mary was going to have a child, that took a lot of courage for Joseph to trust. So now remember, these are all myths and stories, and we have no idea whether they were the truth or not, but they made a point. So we had this wonderful man who was about to come and be the Savior of the Jews, they had been prophesied for hundreds of years in the Old Testament, that this Savior was coming, this Messiah was coming, because they had been nomads and they were constantly being enslaved by all other people, and they were waiting for this Messiah to come and save them from having to be enslaved by yet another group of people. And they've been telling this story for hundreds of years. So now we have the two stories, one written by Matthew, a man named Matthew, and one written by a man named Luke. So in the story of Matthew, there's a star in the east. There's wisdom coming from the three wise men. There's traveling from the east where, and everybody in the Middle East went to the Far East to learn, because that's where the wisdom was. The Hindu religion was there. It was 8,000 years old. It was further east. So you have to realize how they looked at their wisdom and where they got their wisdom. But in the book of Matthew, there were no shepherds. There was no manger. There was no stable. There was no journey. It's interesting. Go home and read the story of Jesus in Matthew and then read the one in Luke and see how different they are. But they were written by two different people who were trying to reach two different audiences. Matthew was trying to reach the Jewish people and to tell them how they missed it, because the Jewish people in Jesus' lifetime did not like Jesus because he broke all the rules. And so they were trying to explain, this man named Matthew was trying to tell the Jews, this man that you didn't like when he was alive, he's your Messiah. So he told the story his way. Then the other, Luke, was a Greek physician, and he wanted everybody, he wanted Jews and Gentiles and everybody to love Jesus. So he told a whole different story. He had, he didn't have the wise men or the manger. He had a totally different story, had a different town. So his story was totally different because he was appealing to a totally different audience. So that's why we have two different stories. Now we have in the New Testament, John talks a little bit about Jesus, but he talks about him metaphysically, about him having a spirit within him. And John, the book of John, if you're ever interested to read the book of John, that whole book is a metaphysical story. John was a metaphysician, and everything he talks about, see, metaphysical is kind of mystical. It's what's happening to us mystically, and that was what John talked about. So we have this whole new story, and every story around the birth of Jesus is different. But all stories have meaning. They have a literal meaning, have a moral meaning, and they have a metaphysical meaning. All biblical stories. So in the literal of the Christmas story, we have the who, what, where, when, and how. That was the literal. That's what we usually hear when we talk about Christmas. The Christmas story recounts a series of miraculous events that culminate in the person of the one we celebrate, the Jesus that we celebrate, is the only one to have ever deemed to be fully human and fully divine. And that's our story. That's the story of Jesus, and that's the story of you and me. And I think that's why this story is so important, and it's still alive so many years later. We're both human and divine. We all are. We're perfectly imperfect in our humanity. But we also have that spiritual in us that when we can tap into it and when we can see that side of ourselves, we have that divinity within us. So all of the stories that are biblical and that are metaphysical have three meanings. The literal, who, what, where, when, and how. The moral, the implied lesson about the consequences of our choices and the decisions we make and the behaviors that we experience when we're dealing with life, when we're dealing with other people, or when we're dealing with nature. An example in the story was when Mary and Joseph decided to believe the angel, Gabriel, and to go with it. That was a very risky thing. I mean, she could have been stoned to death for being pregnant, and he could have been stoned to death for not keeping his agreement with her parents. And so all of these things had the edge of both the human and the divine. And so in the story, the moral of the story is that we trust those messages from God. We listen to those messages from God. And we follow them. And the metaphysical is the lesson, the psychological and spiritual growth and development of us as human beings. This is the story of who we all are as human beings. So the story is metaphysical. It is from the book of Matthew. It is also from the book of Luke. We know that one was Jewish and one was Greek. And we know that they were retelling the story of at least 100 passages in the Old Testament about the coming of the Messiah. We find in the book of the New Testament, Mark doesn't talk about the story of Jesus and Mary. And John only talks about it in metaphysical ways and how it applies to us. So there are so many different ways that we read this story, how it applies to us metaphysically. What is Jesus teaching us? What is that spirit within us? You know, Jesus said the spirit within is the I am. The I am is the God in each one of us. The I am is the part of us that is spiritually divine. It's in us all. We don't always act from it, but it's always there in us. And that's really the story that Jesus' life tells us all. Jesus said, and John, the book of John says this, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. And that's a story for us all. That spirit is in us all at all times. All we have to do is go within and connect to it. So that's why this story of Jesus has lived through all these thousands of years, because it really is who we all are. And somehow we recognize that in us, that we all have that in us, is that divinity and that humanity. And what we want to do is connect to that, to live from that, to live from the spirituality as much as we can, but to remember that it's always there and all we have to do is tap into it. The I am that Jesus talks about is the universal name for the Spirit of God. In the first chapter of John, verse 9, John says, Jesus was the true light which lighted every man who came into the world. So this story that we continue to celebrate 2,000 years, that we call Christmas, We do it because it touches something deep within us. We recognize that something deep within this story is deep within all of us. Because, most stories go away. This story could have gone away a long time ago, but it never has. We're still as weepy when we do the candle lighting ceremony as we always have been. It touches something deeply in us that's mystical in us, that's metaphysical about us, and something very deep in us knows that that is true. And that's why we still celebrate it after all these years. In the 17th century, the philosopher Angelus Silesius said, "Though Christ 1,000 times in Bethlehem be born, if he is not born in thee, thy soul is still forlorn." We're looking for that to be a part of us. That's why we still celebrate Christmas after all these many years. It's your story. It's my story. It's the journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem and back. It's the archetypal level of our consciousness. And we do know that about us in some way. And that's why I think Christmas is such a touchstone for us, How many people show up on Christmas? We used to have to put out extra chairs in the huge auditorium in Houston because we had 4 services. So, Christmas touches our soul so deeply, the stories, the songs, all of it. So, the metaphysics of this is that each one of us has that Christ within us. Remember what the Christ is. The Christ is joy and truth and love, wisdom, and it's in all of us. And it was how Jesus got the name of Christos, because Jesus, more than anybody they had known at that time in history, what's the word I'm trying to do? Demonstrated those attributes. So this year, I'm going to talk to you some more about some more metaphysics. Probably we'll do some more Christmas stuff. But I kind of wanted to give you this morning because I kind of want you to be aware as you move through this Christmas season. You hear the songs that are going to be sung, how they touch you deeply, wanting to go to church on Christmas, whatever it is for you, being with people you love. And notice how that touches you and how it has in the past and how it will be this year. And realize that this is the journey from the head to the heart. Joseph represented the male, the head, the logic, the wisdom, and Mary was the heart. So this whole mystical journey that tells this story without really probably very many facts, but a lot of metaphysical wisdom, is our journey from our head to our heart. And we get to celebrate that once a year and just be with the story and how it affects each and every one of us. One of the books that I took this from is probably in our bookstore back there. It's called A Trip to Bethlehem. And the whole book has all of the metaphysical meanings of all of the characters in the Christmas story, both in Matthew and in Luke. So this month we'll figure out some ways to do some more looking at our own personal Christmas journey and what the story means to us.